CRUDE is a story of this David and Goliath lawsuit in which 30,000 Ecuadorian rainforest dwellers are suing Chevron, the giant oil company Chevron, over alleged contamination of the rainforest. Basically, an area the size of Rhode Island has become, according to the plaintiffs, a cancer death zone. This beautiful part of the rainforest has been completely destroyed by oil production, as the plaintiffs allege. And CRUDE tells the story of this young environmental lawyer named Pablo Fajardo, who in fact worked in the oil fields, was greatly impoverished, had no advantages, and kind of pulled himself up by the bootstraps and got himself educated, got himself a law degree, and is leading the charge in this massive historic lawsuit. The plaintiffs are suing for environmental remediation, basically. You have in this region over 1,000 unlined waste pits of oil leaching into the water table. Over the years, formation water, which is the end product of oil production when you separate oil from water, this material was released into the rivers and streams directly that feed the Amazon area. And so they want the area cleaned up. They want some health care. No one is suing for personal damages, even though a lot of people have suffered tremendous tragedies in their life. Stephen Donziger, the U.S. attorney representing the plaintiffs, came to my office, told me about the case. It seemed like a lot of stuff had already happened. I wasn't sure there was a film that could be made in the style that I like to make a film, which is a present tense unfolding of action, of capturing things as they're happening, and also finding good characters that you can invest in. I mean, that, even though I believe in shining a light on injustice, you also have to entertain an audience and have elements that would make a strong film. So I kind of reluctantly went down to the Amazon, where I had never been. Wasn't sure there was a film to be made, but on the second day of our trip, we pulled up by canoe to one of the Kofan villages, and sitting on the edge of the river were a group of Kofan elders sitting around a fire having lunch, or making lunch, and they were actually eating canned tuna out of this giant industrial vat of some of the cheapest, nastiest looking canned tuna you could ever imagine. And this was deep in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, and they were eating canned tuna because all the fish in their river were dead. And at that point I said, you know what, I'm not sure what kind of film this is going to be, but it really broke my heart to see the condition of the Amazon and the condition of what these people were reduced to. Stephen and I had some very intense conversations at the start of the project. I said, you would not have any right of approval or looking at my footage. I will not work directly with the community in terms of what the final edit of the movie will be. This is going to be my interpretation of what I'm witnessing. And you'll have to trust that I'm going to be a good steward of your story. The film doesn't really take an overt position in the lawsuit. I am not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you whether Chevron has wrapped itself up in enough legal arguments to technically prevail in this case. But I do think what industrialization and what oil production and the methodologies that were used, I do believe that it was morally very, very hard to justify. This film is meant to shine a light on the plight of these people who for decades have suffered terribly. Their way of life has been threatened, their food supply has been threatened, their water, there's just, they've been systematically poisoned. Even if there is a positive judgment against Chevron, I don't believe they will ever pay. I don't think the judgment would ever be enforced unless the court of public opinion becomes so extreme that it does it makes more sense from a business standpoint for them to pay a settlement and clean it up. And until that pressure comes, this case will never get resolved, and another decade will go by and more people will die. I mean, just look at the Exxon Valdez as a great example. There's not even a question of culpability. It was a clear-cut accident, clear-cut responsibility, and yet it took almost 20 years for that punitive judgment to actually be paid. And then at the 11th hour, Exxon convinced a superior court to reduce the settlement by 80%. One of the strengths of CRUDE and one of the things that it's been praised for is its balance. It allows both sides to have their say. And that is kind of a hallmark of my style of filmmaking. Chevron is well represented in the film. I think it makes it a stronger film. I think, in fact, allowing both points of view to be in a film actually makes it a stronger advocacy film, because you don't hand somebody the tools to dismiss your film because they can say, hey, you left this out, you left that out, why didn't you talk about that? I'm a certain kind of filmmaker. I consider myself a storyteller first and a journalist second. It doesn't mean I take my journalistic responsibilities lightly. I mean, I have an obligation to tell the truth in whatever form that I think the truth is. But I also think if you're going to be making films to persuade and move people, you also have to remember certain conventions of cinema so that you can reach a wider audience, so that you can persuade people. And I would never presume to tell somebody else how to make a film. So I'm not saying that I do it the right way and other people do it the wrong way. For me, I think it's a much more engaging cinematic experience when people are confronted with two sides of an argument or multiple sides of an argument, and they can sit in the audience and be like a jury member. The truth is not as black and white as the media and certain advocacy films often present. There are shades of gray. There are complicating circumstances. In this particular case, there are things like, there is a release that Chevron got from the government of Ecuador at the time. Is that a valid release? That's for somebody else to decide. But that is an important issue for people to understand if you really want to have a full understanding of this case. They cleaned up a certain number of pits, they claim. That's an important piece of information for people to fully understand the story. So for me, the best way to be an advocate is to not drill one point of view into somebody and to allow them to reach their own conclusion. Because when somebody is actively engaged in trying to decide what they think, instead of being told what to think, chances are they're going to be much more emotionally engaged in that conclusion. I welcome Chevron embracing the film. I offered to have Chevron participate in the Sundance premiere. I mean, that level of engagement with them, that level of wanting to present both sides, I think is something that certain advocates might be afraid of. One of the biggest things in the film that makes people uncomfortable, but to me it's an example of total honesty that preempts and defuses a criticism from the other side. The fact that this case is not a pro bono lawsuit, that this is a business, that these lawyers want to make money off this case. Now, a lot of advocates would say, or an advocate filmmaker would leave that out. And I was put under a lot of pressure after Sundance to take things like Stephen pulling Trudy aside and saying, hey, Chevron, mention Chevron more, mention Texaco more. I was put under some pressure to, hey, do you really have to mention that this is a for-profit enterprise? I think that kind of honesty is extremely important, because pro bono lawyers handling this case probably wouldn't get very far. You need a Stephen Donziger, who I don't think he's in it for the money, but that's part of his motivation. And so by honestly addressing these issues, I think it's, helps an audience understand really what's at stake here. I've had actually a surprisingly good relationship with Chevron over this film. One of the reasons they participated is that I convinced them that of all the filmmakers out there, I'm probably one of the better ones that they could, cooperate with, because it is my mission to show both sides of the story, because I have the faith that the truth will rise to the top and that my audience will embrace the truth. And that if they wanted to have their point of view in the film, this would be an opportunity. I didn't kid them and say, you're going to love the film. In fact, I said, you're probably going to hate the film or hate parts of it, but there will be parts of the film that you'll embrace. It took a year and a half of repeated dialogue and lunches and meetings to get them to ultimately appear in the film. And now that the film is getting some traction and getting some very positive press, there have been a few pro-Chevron sponsored bloggers who are starting to take pot shots at the movie, but it's awfully hard to tear the movie down because a number of very well-known critics, including the New York Times, have praised the film's balance. Now that we're on the eve of our theatrical release, which is really just the starting point in terms of people's perception of the film, I think now we will know, I think now the film is making Chevron a little uncomfortable. We see over time that Pablo goes from obscurity to becoming somewhat of an international media star over the course of the film. His growth is kind of representative of what it takes to successfully bring a cause into the public consciousness. Stephen worked very hard to get publicity for the case, including getting somebody like me to make a film. He finally lands Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair, the attention that green issue cover story brought the case attracted Trudy Styler. Trudy Styler, the wife of a rock star, arrives on the scene and brings another level of attention. The film observes the sad reality that unless you bring celebrities into a situation like this, it doesn't get news coverage. And so I think in many ways the film is about all the things you have to do besides a legal case to get justice, because we all know, unfortunately, that the justice system, prevailing in the justice system is not about who's right, but who best presents their case. The film is much larger than the pollution case. It's much larger as to who's right or wrong and who polluted the Amazon. It's really a film that I want to open people's hearts and minds to understand that we have treated indigenous people terribly. And multinational behavior in the late 20th and early 21st century, to me, is just the 21st century example, continuation of this trend that began, 500-600 years ago. How multinational corporations have treated regions like the Ecuadorian Amazon, to me, is morally bankrupt. Possibly legally acceptable, but morally bankrupt. And that's, I guess, the largest theme of the film, is that it's much larger than just the lawsuit. It's about corporate behavior and how they can wrap themselves up in legal arguments and deny responsibility, but it's morally unacceptable. I hope people really think about where our products come from. If one oil company has behaved in a certain way, don't buy oil, don't buy gasoline from them. I think the only thing corporations listen to is shareholder pressure and the ring of the cash register. And if the cash register stops ringing, they're going to change their behavior.